Okay, so I am going to be recording a couple of videos, just like to very briefly talk about each section that we've been learning in Professor Carton's class. This is a review for me, but hopefully also for anyone that watches this video, you can, it can help you guys on the exam. I'm sorry I couldn't get these videos out before section 1 took it, but hopefully some people from section 2 were able to watch it. So what is attention? Attention, as defined in its clearest sense, is the process of selectively focusing on certain sensory information while ignoring other stimuli. For example, if you're trying to take notes in class, or if you're in a movie theater watching a movie, all of these things require attention. You can't take notes while not paying attention to what the professor is trying to say, just the same as you can't watch a movie without actually paying attention to the screen instead of looking at your phone. Okay, so there's different types of attention. We're going to be talking about each different bullet point that was discussed in the slides that Professor Carton had. So the first one is selective attention. Selective attention is the ability to selectively attend to certain stimuli. So what does that mean? So if we took the example from earlier, like watching a movie, it would mean to focus on the relevant sensory information, like as Ice Cube yelling at Schmidt to tune out all of the irrelevant sensory information, like what's going on in the background. You're focusing on the main characters on screen instead of focusing on the background information in that frame, right? So without filtering our attention, our brain would be extremely overloaded, and it would actually lead to a huge loss of important details, and we wouldn't be able to remember a lot of things because our focus is so split apart that we can't focus on just a couple of things that we should keep in mind in order to have better memory retention. And so Professor Carton, I don't think she really dived into the symptoms of schizophrenia and ADHD, and so we're not going to be covering that as well, but we are going to be covering the sensory part of the disorders. So for both disorders, diagnosed individuals tend to attend to everything with all sensory input given equal weight. So what this means is that people with schizophrenia, people with ADHD, especially with ADHD, right, because it's attention deficit hyperactive disorder, it means that they literally lack an attention filter. So they attend to everything, every single stimuli in their surrounding as the same thing. They have no ability to focus on one thing. They attend to everything with equal amounts of attention. Okay, so the next is the cocktail party phenomenon. And it was something I kind of had to Google later because I've never been to a cocktail party before. So the cocktail party phenomenon is actually just a term for when we are in a large group or crowd of people. And so when we are in a large crowd, what people don't realize is that all information like talking and sound is processed at a baseline level. However, it is only when a stimulus catches our attention that we become aware of it. It's, for example, if you're at a party, you have this baseline level of audio because you're in a crowd, right? So everyone's talking around you. But you really only attend to a certain stimulus if it is something that catches your attention. Like if somebody from somewhere across the room in the party says your name, it's above that baseline level, so you attend to that stimulus, okay? So if it was below this baseline level of audio, you wouldn't really perceive or pay attention to it. So the next thing we're gonna be talking about is the spotlight theory of attention. The spotlight theory of attention is actually it's a pretty good name for what it's actually describing. So our visual attention works like a spotlight, right? So it means that we only receive the most amount of information and processing from the current thing that we are focusing on. So for example, right now I'm focusing on looking at the camera and also looking at my script, okay? I'm not really taking in the rest of my room, right? So all of that is just background information to me. I'm focusing on a couple of things because it gives me more sensory input. And that way I have better memory retention because I'm looking at the script and not looking at, other things around my room. Okay, so there's a couple of different types of visual attention, so I'm going to run through it super quick, but you can also find the table in the description on page 2 of my notes. So bottom-up attention is stimulus-driven. So for example, that's like a bright light being shown onto your eyes, and it causes our attention to shift immediately to that stimulus. Top-down processing is more goal-directed, like searching for your car in the parking lot. And then there's also selective attention, which is a combination of both, but is more about choosing to focus on one thing and ignoring irrelevant background information. And so the last type is actually saccades, which we are going to focus on in a bit. Okay, so eye movements. You ever notice how when you look at something and, if you're looking at a stimulus, your eyes seem to dart, especially if you're looking at like a TV show, right? Like on the screen, you're not focusing at one point on the screen for a super long time. It's usually you're darting around the screen. And I have this in my notes, like the actual path, for example, path of our eye movements. So those are saccades. And another example is for example, when I'm writing a script or when I'm taking notes, my eyes would move incrementally from word to word, from my notes to my exam and then to my keyboard. From my notes to my screen and then to my keyboard. But why don't we notice like a violent jump or transition? So it's actually, they're called saccade, so just rapid eye movements. We have about 2 to 3 eye movements per second, and the reason we don't actually perceive it is because our brain is able to process the gap in between it and make it flow smoothly. So this way we don't like if you look at my eyes, right? Like if I'm moving my eyes across my field of vision right now, but my brain is able to process it in a way where it's smooth. It's not like jumpy. In reality, it is jumpy, but I don't notice it. And that's because of our brain being able to process that and make our viewing experience smoother. Okay, so what is visual search? Visual search is to look for an object within a larger display that often contains a lot of different elements. So she has a bunch of different like photos and pictures that she uses for visual search. We're going to be focusing on 2 different types of visual searches. The first is a featural search. So that's when you're just looking for one thing in a search, right? So let's say like you're looking for a black Yamaha R3, a bunch of blue Yamaha R3s, right? So it's just a motorcycle, right? But they're all the same brand, they're all the same model, all the same year. The only defining characteristic that is different is just the color. So it's one black motorcycle within a field of blue ones. Okay, that's why it's a featural search, because you're only looking for one specific feature. That's the difference. So conjunction search is if you have 2 or more of those. So 2 or more features in a search. That is what a conjunction search is. That's it. Let's say like, you know, the example I used was like Labubus, right? But like, if you're looking for a Labubu within a bunch of stuffed animals, right? It would be like you're not just looking for the Labubu shape, right? It would be a featural search if it was a 24 karat Labubu in a bunch of pink Labubus, right? But instead, you're looking for the shape of the stuffed animal, the color, maybe the texture, or maybe like the material, right? All of these things are different, so they add up and make a conjunction search. Okay. So the next thing is feature integration theory. So feature integration theory is the theory that there are stages in which features are noticed in our visual perception. So the first stage of the feature integration theory is the pre-attentive stage, where you know, we only basic features like color, orientation, super basic stuff is pre-processed, and it's processed automatically before, you know, we register like this is a thing. So the second stage is the second stage is the focused attention stage, where individual objects are selected. Features are integrated to represent objects and things. So in regards to feature integration theory, we also have an implication. So an implication is when we have errors in feature binding. So like, let's say, for example, I'm looking at something, and because our attention is maybe divided, or you know, we're distracted, we might misidentify something as something else. We might remember we might remember things incorrectly. This is part of the reason why eyewitness testimony is so like unreliable. Is part of the reason because we might be doing something like, let's say we witness a crime, right, and we're called in to provide a witness testimony. Realistically, we can't provide as solid of an evidence as we think we can if the trial is like moved like several months away from the actual crime. The reason is because when we were witnessing the crime, we might not be like a directly involved witness. We might have just been like, you know, let's say you're on the side of the road while somebody is getting shot, right? You're probably just minding your business, right? So when you notice that somebody is getting shot, you look that way and you see the person that is holding the gun, your attention is not directly like hard focused on the person that's holding the gun. It might just be on the scene in general. So you might miss details about it, right? So that's the thing where implication like plays a huge role in like why eyewitness testimony is such a problem. Okay. Now we're going to be talking about illusory junctions. So illusory junctions occur when the brain erroneously combines features from separate objects, and it creates a perceived stimulus that isn't actually there. For example, you know, we can look at the Treisman and Schmidt paradigm. Subjects were presented with different colored shapes, like a red triangle and a yellow circle, etc., and with numbers on opposite sides of the shape. They were then asked to remember and report the numbers. But after, with their attention having been focused on the numbers and not the colored shapes, they were actually asked to recall the colored shapes correctly. However, because their focus was on the numbers and not the colored shapes, about 20% of the participants would jumble the objects around, like saying, you know, there's a yellow triangle, and this means they had illusory conjunctions. Okay, so it's because our stimulus is so you know, incorrect. Our stimulus that we're focusing on is so different from what we were asked to recall. We might jumble up facts. This also plays into a part in eyewitness unreliability. Okay, so the next thing is overt attention. So overt attention is super important when we talk about attention, and especially with the lecture. So overt attention is when you actively turn your head to direct your vision to a specific area. It's intentional. And it's actually what most people use to view things in their lives. So, right, for example, right now I'm using overt attention because my eyes are directly pointed at the camera and at like my script that I'm reading off of, because these are the things that like I'm currently like involved in right now, right, at this moment. Okay. Covert attention, all you have to think of is like sneaky. Like when you think of covert, like covert ops, right? It's sneaky. It's not like you're doing it in a not purposeful, or sorry, maybe that's not right. Like a not public way, I guess. Like covert attention is basically when you're attending to a stimulus. Like for example, if I look at the screen right now, if I look at my camera right now, and instead of focusing on the camera, I'm instead focusing on like my closet in the background. Okay, so you can't tell that from my perspective because my eyes, my pupils are directed point blank at the camera. But in my periphery, I'm actually paying attention to the closet, not to the camera. Okay, so that's what covert attention is. I'm not trying to direct my pupils there, right? It's in my periphery. That's what covert attention is. So now let's transition to attention and information processing. Okay, so we're going to be talking about two different experiments and tasks. So the first is the Posner cueing paradigm. And so the goal of the Posner cueing paradigm is to measure how directed attention influences reaction time and accuracy. So I'm not going to dive into the specific procedure in detail, but the gist is that participants were asked to focus on a square in front of them. An arrow would appear and indicate where a light in the person's periphery would flash. But there would be three different scenarios, one with no pre-cue, and the participant would have to figure out whether the light would appear right or left, which would serve as a baseline reaction time. It would be a valid pre-cue, with the arrow pointing correctly to the light where it would flash, and then an invalid pre-cue, where it would point to the opposite side of where the light would flash. So results ended up showing that observers responded fastest when the cue was valid and slowest when the cue was invalid. The second experiment is the Sperling sensory memory and covert attention task. So Sperling et al. Discovered that sensory memory is a high-capacity short visual store that lasted around 500 milliseconds, which is half a second, that could hold a snapshot of a visual scene. So what this means is individuals have a roughly 500 millisecond, half a second picture memory where they remember a large portion of objects in memory. They can only hold this for give or take half a second. So a couple of other interesting phenomena that reveal the limits in visual attention. So one of them is inattentional blindness and the other is change blindness. So inattentional blindness is when we are unable to perceive an unexpected stimulus that is in plain view because our attention is already preoccupied. For example, let's say you're driving on the side of the road, you're driving on a road, and you're also texting at the same time. This is inattentional blindness. Because your focus is split on driving and also on texting, you don't actually notice an object, person, or animal, or whatever thing is in front of your car until it's too late, because your attention is focused on your phone, and maybe it's not that focused on driving. That's what inattentional blindness is. Okay, change blindness is completely different. So there's that experiment that Professor Carden showed in class. I think a lot of us probably have seen it before in like Gen Psych. It's basically the experiment of like a dribbling experiment, and there was like a stimulus that came in that was not, I don't remember off the top of my head what it was, but I'll put it in the video, whatever. That's what change blindness is. Okay, it's when we're focusing on something else and there's an inability to detect a change of a feature in a scene. Okay, so divided attention is pretty easy. It's actually exactly what it describes. Partial attention is given to more than one task that you are doing. So there's positives and negatives. Okay. So the positives are in sports when someone needs to perform multiple tasks at the same time, like for example, like dribbling a basketball and trying to find the hoop, finding an opening to push past defenders and get to the basket. And the negatives are tasks like listening to music while studying. Studies have actually shown that if you listen to music while studying, it actually decreases or harms memory retention. I still do. I don't really care, but it does apparently harm memory retention. So the final thing that we're going to be talking about is brain correlates and lesions. So parietal lobe lesions are lesions that impair the ability to allocate attention across space. And causes of parietal lobe lesions, I don't think Professor Carden said this in class, I could be wrong, but I don't remember. It's typically strokes. So it causes a part of your body to seem numb, and you actually lose nerve ability. Like your nerves, after a stroke, and I can speak this from experience because my dad actually suffered from a stroke like 2 years ago. What happens is, when I noticed that he had a stroke, I had to drive him to the hospital. His, like, inside, I think it was his right side. So his right side of his body, he completely lost, like, a lot of feeling. So he can still use it now, but it's because he does, like, physical therapy and, like, stretches it and stuff. But he, like, you lose a lot of feeling, and it actually, it just impairs a lot of attention. And so you kind of lose a lot of, like, feeling and vision and a lot of just, nerves in that side of your body. Okay, And so the last thing we're going to be talking about is balance syndrome. Balance syndrome is also a correlate of a lesion. So it occurs when damage comes to the occipital or parietal lobe, and there's a list of deficits. So super quick: impaired voluntary eye movements and visual scanning, inaccurate reaching for objects, difficulty focusing on a single object when multiple are presented, and failure to bind spatial features. Okay. All right. So last thing. For sure, last thing, is the Stroop task. So the purpose of the Stroop task is to measure causal relations between manipulations in font color and verbal response time. So participants were tasked with reading a vertical list of color words printed in mismatched colors and had to report the font color and not the word. So the findings were that incongruent trials ended up producing longer reaction time than congruent ones. This is to say, if the font color matched the word color, reaction time decreased. If the font color and word color were different, it would increase reaction time because of processing that it took. Okay, so that's pretty much everything that you have to know about attention. I hope I covered everything, and I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll be uploading the couple of other videos that for every other section that we learned. Eventually, hopefully I can get them all out before the test, but we'll see.